Happy Thanksgiving. That's what I heard. I don't know if you heard it too. Happy Thanksgiving. Wow. Some of us are not excited about being with extended family. Maybe we have different views on something. I don't know. Oh, man. Well, I'll take it as it's still early enough to be tired, and we'll go with that excuse. Okay. So I'm going to jump right in, friends. Welcome if this is your first time with us. My name's Kurt. I'm one of the pastors here. Something terrible happened yesterday, and I need to tell you about it. Some of you saw it on Facebook. I have a daughter named Chloe, and she's very cute. Chloe got angry. So angry. The only way to really tell you about it is on a slide, so I'm just going to show you. That's her school photo that tells you one thing about her. That's where the feelings plus toy projectile led our very one-year-old television I got after having surgery. Yes, there's a crack in the screen. Now, if you were to look at her, you would think this child could never do something like that. I mean, look at that face. She's adorable. I need you to know, she has the ability to destroy stuff, to ruin my living room experience. This is what has happened, friends. And you know, as a parent, you think to yourself, oh, at least my TV, at least I can handle the late nights and the exhaustion, and she wakes up every night and comes into our room at some point because she doesn't like being in her, I could do all of that. The TV, right? There has to be a line. There has to be something that's worth it was weird though. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but for whatever reason, and I'm just going to say it's Jesus, I wasn't angry. I should be, right? I should be flustered, maybe a little flustered. We'll say flustered. But angry just didn't show up. And I'm kind of I want to be proud of myself because of that, but I actually just want to say I think Jesus was being kind to my daughter. I don't know. Goodbye, TV. It was a good year and 2 months. It was a great splurge of a lot of money. And I think one of the things that I was learning, and it's funny when you're a teacher like me and you talk about the Bible and God and formation and Jesus, right? It's funny that sometimes in the middle of getting ready to do this thing I do on Sunday, I get to learn something about the thing I'm going to do on Sunday. And I don't know if that's just the way Jesus likes to remind me of humility or whatever. I don't know. But what I do know is that this is a great illustration because it's going to help us just go somewhere today. Because when I look at this slide, I see on one side of it what matters. Life, love, that child who we got to have a great parenting moment with, right? We got to actually say, hey, kiddo, what you did's a big deal. And we had her process and sit with it. I mean, she's not even 4 yet, right? So toddler experience of this. But we got to sit with her and we got to actually help her see that she needed to actually apologize to mommy, daddy, and Lydia before it was okay to move on. And that took a minute. More like 100, but it was good. Because I think, for whatever reason, Jesus, we realized in the moment that life and love, that's where all the value actually is, and not in the stuff we have. But I'll tell you what, when my Seahawks are playing, and I've got to go to my old TV, first world problems, my old TV, maybe all those feelings will start to show up. I don't know. But it really raises a question, doesn't it? Because we have to ask ourselves, are we really on the daily basis when things happen, Are we leaning into life and love? Or are we leaning into comfort, stuff, preference? The Bible over and over will talk about two crowns, a crown that leads to life and a crown that leads to destruction and pain and suffering. And, if I value the TV more than that smile, in that moment I might be wearing the wrong crown. And we're going to see that this morning. This is an illustration that the Bible uses often, and the book of Revelation uses it quite a bit, talking about what crown we're going to pursue, what reward, what thing, what telos, to use an ancient Greek word. What's that thing we're aiming for? Is it life informed by the love of a God who gives everything so that we might inherit everything? Or is it the world we live in that defines what we value most? Today, what I want to suggest is that we're going to see that power that God offers, the beautiful subversive power that God offers us, is life and life to the full, even when life isn't easy. We're going to be in a city called Smyrna. Can we say Smyrna together? It's really hard to say for me. Smyrna. Smyrna. Yeah. Sounds ancient, doesn't it? Yeah. Smyrna. Like it should be in the Lord of the Rings or something, Smeagol, Smyrna. We're in the same lane, right? And Smyrna is the city that is addressed in chapter 2 of Revelation after Ephesus. And so we're going to really look at this city, and it's not a very long passage, but we're going to really try and see what it looks like for this city to wear that crown that leads to life. So, before we do that, let's jump in. I want to give us a few just thoughts to recap last week. Last week, by the way, if you were here or kind of caught the teaching online, you know that it was like the fire hose of overview, right? I gave you just tons of information because I wanted to set us up well for the rest of our time together in chapters 2 and 3 so that we could really just hone in on the historical situation. And so we're going to just review that. That's going to be very short. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to part 1 of our series called 7 Words to the Church today, I just invite you to go consider doing that if you have time in the car, as you commute, etc. A few resources from last week, I'm going to mention them again. There are some books. If you want to chase down any of those interesting questions about Revelation, this is where I would start, either on the general level reading or more academic reading. That will just get you started. Okay, so what is Revelation? Revelation is 3 things. It is a letter, it is a prophecy, and it is an apocalypse. A letter, in other words, it addresses a community or a group of communities that existed in a real place, in a real time. It's not some sort of abstract sort of thing that would talk about churches way down the line. It's about real historical situations to real historical people. And that's what we're focusing on in this series in the first couple of chapters. It's a prophecy. In other words, it is a book, a letter that actually says things about the future, but says a lot of things about the present reality of good versus evil, these sorts of themes, suffering, persecution. And so it forthtells and it foretells. Does that make sense? And then apocalypse, which is a very particular genre that emerges after parts of the writings of Daniel, for instance. And it is a genre that is typically rooted in resisting foreign enemies, usually the Roman Empire. In fact, if we had way more time, I would jump to a book called 2nd Esdras, where it's not in the Bible, so don't go looking for it. It's not there. But it's a apocalyptic letter written in the 1st century or so, and it does very similar things with imagery, very similar points it makes. It even goes as far as calling out the Roman Empire by using the image of an eagle which is sort of their national animal. And that eagle, let me tell you, the Lion of Judah does a number on that poor eagle. You can imagine it is trying to resist the forces of evil as manifested through the Roman Empire. Revelation does that, at least at the historical level. We talked a lot more about that last week. I gave you a slogan last week that's just going to bring it back. It's just helpful for framing at least the base level of what Revelation is trying to do. The last book of the Bible is a revelation of Jesus. In other words, the book reveals Jesus himself to John. John receives it for the church, 7 churches actually, against the empire, both the demonic forces of evil as they manifest themselves through the Roman Empire at the time that was oppressive and hurting people, including the ancient Jewish people and the early Jesus followers. It's during the first century, and we talked about the real realities on the ground during the first century last week. And it has a deep, beautiful, profound hope for the future. Everything that is broken will be made right. Every tear will be wiped away. This world will be remade, renewed, restored. Heaven on earth will be our final, real reality. Friends, that is the beautiful good news of Revelation. Revelation is less about doom and gloom and more about gardens that will bloom. We have to keep it in perspective that the word at the end of the book, the goal of the end of the book, is that heaven would touch earth forever, and you and I would live with God forever in resurrected reality, just like Jesus experienced on Easter morning. How many of you want that? Amen. Yeah. So, let's step in to where we're going. So, there's a map. This is the situation. This is all the places that are mentioned in this part of the letter. Patmos is where John is situated. It's off the coast of what nowadays is called Turkey. This is Asia Minor in the first century. And we notice that the way the letter is written, the structure of it, follows the horseshoe shape of the cities. So it's going from Patmos, and he addresses Ephesus first, then today Smyrna, then we'll be in Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. You see how that kind of works? Isn't that kind of fun? And so that's what we're focusing on in this series, because it seems as though things that were happening in the church back then have application for the church today. Okay, let's keep going. So last week we talked about the city of Ephesus. They had lost their first love. They had forgotten the passion and the joy and the immense beauty of following Jesus. And today, that city we looked at, this metropolis, this sort of center of commerce, its next door neighbor is going to be highlighted, and that's Smyrna, as we already know. But in Ephesus and Smyrna and elsewhere, in all of these cities, you have to sort of put yourself in their shoes. If you're a follower of Jesus and you're living in this place, and you are connected to Judaism, right? So in the first century, a lot of Christianity still was very Jewish. That isn't to say they weren't following all the dietary laws necessarily, all that stuff, but it's still very connected. In our minds, as modern Westerners, right, we separate them pretty far, except, the Old Testament and sort of the roots, and then we kind of come out of that, and we're Gentiles or whatever. In the first century, it wasn't so stark. It was actually quite messy on the ground. And so we're going to hear some of that language today, but that really has big ramifications for how they navigated what it meant to be a follower of Israel's God in the first century when Rome said, you got to worship who we worship. Here's a slide I did share last week of the imperial gods. And I want to just repeat these so that you just have a frame for what we're talking about. So in the first century, in Asia Minor in particular, These gods would have their own temples. Some of them would just have an altar. Some would have temple, priest, altar, like the whole getup. If you're in Ephesus, it's bigger. If you're in Smyrna, it's pretty big. We'll talk about that. But these are gods that the Roman Empire worshipped from the time of Augustus, which they included the emperors themselves. And so you have Pax, the god of peace. And how does peace happen in this system? It's not nice things. It's, hey, guess what? Our army is bigger than yours. We can either flatten your city to the ground, or you can submit to us. We'll let you keep some of your culture, and you just start paying us taxes now. That's what peace meant in the Roman Empire. It meant basically we're going to annex you, we're going to draw resources from you, but guess what? If you play your cards right, we're going to build you some really nice roads and aqueducts. Wouldn't that be great, right? That was peace. That was peace in the first century. And then we have Nike, again, right? Nike named their shoe after this goddess. I found out after wearing Nikes my whole life. And Nike is a Greek word that means victory. In Latin, it's victory, or Victoria is that goddess. And basically, anytime a victory happened, like when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, victory would kind of process with her wings and sort of be the sort of champion of that victory, the celebration. Of course, we talked about Roma last week, the glorious embodiment of the Roman Empire. She was Rome personified, and then the emperors are worshipped in various forms, especially, by the way, in Asia Minor. In Asia Minor, the worship of the emperors is more intense than even in Rome during this time. So how does this break down by city? Let's look at this really quick. So Pergamum was the first city to adopt a specific cult to the royal family. Only a few years after Augustus wins the Great War, the Great Civil War, which was won in 31 BC. So in 29, remember, time's going backwards, if that sort of helps your brain here. In 29, a few years later, they say, hey, can we just worship you? And he says, okay, you can worship me, it's cool. This is Augustus. Just make sure you worship Julius Caesar and Roma, and maybe Zeus sometime. And he basically says, sure. In other words, yeah, if they would have worshiped me, why not? I'm a pretty big deal. I'm Caesar Augustus. Hello? I mean, Augustus means worthy of veneration, and it was a given name, right? So, yeah, I think the guy had a big picture of himself. Let's say it that way. Pergamum, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Sardis each hosted imperial temples, altars, and had their own priests. Thyatira lacked the temple, but had an altar and a priest. Philadelphia had everything but the altar. Laodicea, although lacking a temple and a priest, maintained an imperial altar. So anywhere you went in these cities, you would be expected to burn incense, worship, give tribute to the gods of the empire. And the question is, why? How many of us find that weird? Right? Like you go to the supermarket, there's not like an altar to some god that you're supposed to pay tribute to, right? It's just not how we think. We kind of put religion in a box here. We put personal feelings in a box. We put what I do for work in a box. And sometimes they mix up, but it feels sort of awkward for us even at times, right? And that's just how our culture has shaped us to sort of categorize things in tidy compartments. In the first century, nothing is tidy like that. In the first century, everything is religious. Everything is tied to everything else. Are you following? You are always doing religious things. To buy something is an act of religious devotion. Here's a quote from a couple of scholars that'll kind of name this. It says that the imperial cult was a social glue is reflected in the word religion, and this being a Latin word, religion. In ancient Rome, religio meant the ties that bind people together. Wait a second. Let's stop here for a minute. Wouldn't that be cool if we were kind of known for that as Christians outside of this whole system, right? What if coming to church and being a Christian, a big part of it was Jesus is our tie that binds us together, right? It's actually not all bad if you have the right thing in the center of it all. In its social function continuing, this is what the imperial cult did. To a great extent, the best that the city had to offer was mediated through the imperial temples, worship, commerce, culture, celebration. These were the religio that bound the people of the Asian cities together in the broader circle of empire. Everything you did was religious in some way, shape, or form. And so as we step into Smyrna, we have to have a different set of goggles on about how the world works, or else it's not going to really make a lot of sense. You following? Are you ready to be first century people for a few minutes? Yeah, Kurt, that sounds great. Thanks. That's what I want to do on Thanksgiving. Yeah. Okay, good. That's what you should want to do every day of your life. It's the best. Anyway, let's keep going. Sorry. I like books. Is that weird? Okay. So, as we step in, here's one more thing. You're going to notice a structure that comes up over and over again. We saw it last week. I want you to just sort of intuit this structure. Every letter, which when I say letter, it's really like an oracle. It's a message to a particular church that's part of the bigger letter, which we call Revelation. You'll see a command of some sort. Hey, write this down. You'll hear the sender of the message. These are the words of ... There's commendation or condemnation, sometimes a fusion. Jesus says something like, I know your deeds, right? Well, we're going to find today in Smyrna that there's no condemnation, which is really unique, and we'll talk about maybe why that is. There's a concern, hey, don't fear, repent, these sorts of things. An invitation, call for obedience, and of course, a challenge, like if you follow this through, a different kind of victory is on the other side of it, yeah? So let's notice this structure as we read the letter to the church in Smyrna. Write this to the angel of the church in Smyrna. These are the words of the one who is the first and the last, who died and came back to life. There's no guesswork here. We know who the sender of the message is. This is Jesus. Jesus is saying, I am eternal, and I died, and I came back. And you have this message, and you need to take it as though I, Jesus, am saying it, not John. This is Jesus. Now, it's fascinating, especially this idea of dying and coming back to life. When you talk about Smyrna, this is their story. Have you ever been part of a story that fit a resurrection motif? Maybe in your own life, something was going good, it got flattened, but then on the other side of that hardship came something good again. Smyrna understood this narrative. In fact, up until 600 BC, the city of Smyrna was awesome. It was glorious. And basically, it was destroyed by the Lydian kingdom, which is a kingdom for which my daughter Lydia is the ringleader, I'm told. So there you are. I gotta tell her this story. This is a good one. Hey, did you know that you conquered Smyrna? You know, that'd be great. Good bedtime story. Yeah. Go be peaceful. Okay, anyway. Now, these are the ruins from that original old city. You see the pillars and the foundation back there. Those are the only ruins we have excavated from that original version of Smyrna. And it's fascinating because, this comes as a little bit of the Temple of Athena that had been built in 700 BC. I mean, this is a long time ago. But then the city sort of becomes a bunch of villages, and it's not until Alexander the Great is doing his thing and bringing Hellenization, the Greek culture, etc., throughout the Mediterranean and conquest and all that stuff, that he reestablishes the city. And in reestablishing it, he basically has created an ally. And of course, the Romans end up liking what Alexander had to offer in a lot of ways and adopt a lot of that. And so when Rome is up and coming as a city-state, it actually is in Smyrna where they find an ally east of them. And so Smyrna, during a Cold War scenario, actually decides to start worshiping the goddess Roma in 195 BC. So this is way before emperor worship. They, out of the blue, say, hey, we want to be like Rome. We want to worship Roma. And so they have a temple dedicated to Roma at that time. And Rome forever will remember their loyalty. I mean, it's crazy because there's a war that's about to brew during this time called the Roman Seleucid War. And basically, I believe it's on the next slide, we see a little bit more. Rome is surrounded on one side by Carthage, another big city-state that they had fought in the past and were always kind of in Cold War with. And then the Seleucid Empire, sort of in the east, is trying to take Asia Minor as a stronghold. And Rome doesn't think this is a good idea. And so when Smyrna says we're loyal to Rome, it's a big deal. In fact, the writer Cicero, who maybe you had to read in college, I don't know, someone might have. This is what Cicero said. He said that Smyrna was among our most faithful and most ancient allies. So Smyrna was all in on the Rome thing. It was, in fact, because of Alexander's initial love for the city and rebuilding it, and then Rome coming in and saying, we are going to support you, we are going to be your ally because you're our ally, it gets rebuilt. And it is a city that had died and came back to life again. Here are some pillars of the Agora, which is kind of the main city center, shopping, commerce, political, all the stuff, religious center of the city that we do have. And here's what many scholars say, that when Jesus says that he is the one who died and came back to life, that the impact particularly in Smyrna would have been intensely obvious. Their narrative said, we used to be great, we died, and now we're great again. Smyrna knows resurrection. So, the next verse kind of gives us a little more to work with. It says, I know your hardship and poverty, though you are actually rich. So they're interesting here because what you need to know about Smyrna too is it's a wealthy place by the time of Jesus and the apostles. They've got all they need. They are consumers. They have chosen the crown of consumption and living it large. I mean, they've got all of the things. And so as an early follower of Jesus, you had to ask yourself the question, what ways will I engage in the Agora marketplace? What ways will I engage in all of the things around me? Because again, you don't want to completely be sort of like a hermit outside of society. You want to influence society as a follower of Jesus. But at the same time, everything was religious. It was hard to avoid idolatry in Smyrna as a follower of Jesus. What do you do when you're asked if you've burned incense to the altar of the Roman emperor, doing your civic duty? They even had like paperwork to prove this in some situations. I mean, what do you do? How do you engage? And here they are trying to be faithful, trying to do the Jesus thing. But here's the thing that the verse really shows us in a lot of ways. It's like, look, you guys have had it hard lately. And by the way, it's going to get worse. And yet you're a rich community. What's going on here? There's a lot of pressure. The pressure comes from a lot of things. But one is, are we willing to give up everything to gain everything that's better? Have you ever had to give something up? Release it. And you didn't really want to, but you knew it was the best thing to do. Smyrna is going to have to ask that question over and over again. Am I willing to release what I want to cling to? They had to resist consumerism. And look, if they wanted to say, you know what, instead of the Jesus thing, we're just going to do the Roman thing like all our neighbors. It's easier. Maybe we can just compromise a little bit so we can have all that we need, and we'll still add Jesus to our gods, right? But that's not a choice. It's Jesus or nothing. It's the privilege of being a good Roman in Smyrna, or the privilege of dying for someone for whom Rome had executed, right? And they had to decide what was going to be powerful. Consumerism is something we struggle with. In our day, I struggle with it. We all struggle with it. If you're in a Western context, it's all around us, marketing. And back then, it was hard too for them. In fact, I think it's fair to say that there's a difference between consuming things and consumerism, right? It's not as though having money in and of itself is sin or whatever. It's about the ism. It's about saying, look, when I have stuff, am I investing what I have into the crown of life or into the crown of Rome or whatever my consumption is aiming to fulfill, you know? Two authors in a book called Hidden Worldviews say it this way. They say consumerism absolutizes consumption by believing that we can find fulfillment by accumulating wealth and everything that comes with it. You know, this is probably one of the hardest challenges for those of us who, yes, many of us probably have debt of some sort, but who have basic shelter, food, clothing, more than necessities. And this isn't about kind of saying, oh man, I should feel bad because I've had access to a decent life. But it is about saying, how has the ism affected me? Where does the ism start and stop as I try to pursue Christ? You know, Lauren and I were at dinner on Friday. It was my birthday on Thursday, and so on Friday, happy birthday, my TV's broken. Anyway, on Friday, her and I went on a date, and we're sitting there, and she's like, had been asking me, like, so hey, what's the sermon on this week? And you know, I'm like, oh yeah, there's some consumerism stuff, Revelation, whatever. And I was like, oh, how odd. I just ordered the nachos and the tater tots that I don't need for my appetizer. And we had a fun little laugh about it, right? Because it's everywhere. It's like, it's always around us. And it's not like, here's the problem that some of us face. There's two extremes. There's the, I can't do anything fun. And the other extreme is, I just do things that feel fun, you know? And Jesus invites us to be sacrificial and wise and stewards of those kinds of resources and saying, how am I investing my time, talent, and treasure into the crown of life? Because this other thing is going to fade away, but this thing is where it all matters. Be it a relationship with a toddler, be it in how you deal with everything else. When Lydia was 19 months old, I know this because I went back and listened to an old sermon, so that's why that detail is so perfect. But when she was about 19 months old, I was reminded of this thing that we used to do. It's so good. We had this plastic cup that on top of it had a rubber lid that you can put your fingers through. Some of you know what I'm talking about, right? And it's like a sippy cup, but it's for food, dry food. And she had this, and I remember there's a pink one and a green one. One, by the way, that we left on a bench at the park while we were playing, side story, and a crow grabbed it and started pouncing away. And here's the thing, you don't mess with crows. I didn't know that yet. I'm pretty sure that crow is still haunting me even in Calgary. I don't know because I chased it down. But this cup is in our family for quite a while. And at this age, she was always willing to share with me, it seemed. Hey, can Daddy have a bite of your dessert? Oh, yeah, Daddy, here you go. And she just loved to feed me or whatever, teaching, sharing, whatever. But there came a day when the Cheerios cup became something else. I would say, can Daddy have some Cheerios? And I'd put my hand out, and she'd go, here you go, put it in my hand. And I'd be like, oh, you're so kind. And then the little stinker would go, boop, and put it in her mouth, right? And I'm like, what? You were supposed to be the one who loves your daddy and hooks him up. And that ended, yes, before 2 years. So what are you going to do? But I just remember that, and I remember thinking, you know what? I'm tempted that way too. Like, I'm tempted to be like, I'm going to give something. I'm going to help others. I'm going to live a life of love, but I also want to get something back. I want to kind of cling to something. Maybe I'm not ready, And I think that's one of the temptations we're going to see in this church over and over again. And the cost of choosing the crown that leads to life is going to be immense. The next verse really keeps us going on this. It says, I also know the hurtful things that have been spoken about you by those who say they are Jews, though they are not, but are really Satan's synagogue. This passage has been used terrible. Go back. It's been used to promote anti-Semitism. It's been used all kinds of different ways. But if we place it back into the first century, you have to understand what's happening on the ground. At this point in time, Jewish people are the only ones who are exempt from paying any kind of worship to the empire. They're literally exempt because Caesar Augustus was like, this isn't worth the fight. They are monotheists, which makes no sense to me. I'm just going to let them do their thing. They just have to pay a tax and pray to their God once a year in honor of the empire. Still gross, but And so in cities like this, you can imagine where early Christianity and Judaism are very close to each other, the Jewish people start to get worried that it's going to get convoluted because you have all of these non-Jewish people joining the Jesus movement that aren't ready, technically part of the exemption. And so Christians over time, for a while, they look like Jewish people. It works. It's okay. They don't have to do all that stuff. They claim the exemption. But there are Jewish people who start to say, no, 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 you're going to ruin it for all of us. And there's a sense that they accuse and cause hardship, even in this passage. In fact, to say Satan, of course, is to bring up the accuser. And there's almost a double entendre here of they are accusing under the power of the accuser. And so they're starting to experience real persecution. Their status quo has been threatened. And so as we keep reading, it says, don't be afraid, verse 10, of what you're going to suffer. Look, the devil is going to throw some of you into prison in order to test you. You will suffer hardship for 10 days, which either is a metaphorical number that we just don't know exactly what it means, or had a lot of relevance to this church. I don't know about the 10 days thing. It's going to be bad. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Here's the punchline. Which crown do we want? Do we want an upside-down, subversive, Jesus-following crown that doesn't look like we're going to expect it to look, but is the way of Christ? Or do we want the glorious, beautiful, easy, consumption-driven life of the normal crown that the world offers? When you approach Smyrna, it's beautiful. When you're in a boat, you're coming from the west, and you see Smyrna, you see the harbor. These are some old drawings. It came to be known as the Crown of Smyrna. When you would come to the city, you would see the hills that line the city, and you can even almost see it in these depictions why it would be called a crown. It was the crown of Smyrna, was its wealth, its splendor, its awe-inspiring view. And the church has to say, we are going to suffer and not pursue the crown. In the 2nd century, Polycarp of Smyrna, who was ordained by John the Apostle, as church tradition tells us, his story of his death is written down. He's from the city. It's a little bit after Revelation was penned. And I want to just read it to you as we move towards a close here. The whole multitude, marveling at the bravery of the God-loving and God-fearing race of Christians, began shouting, "Away with the atheists." In other words, they don't have a lot of gods, they just have one. And so they're atheists in that world, right? "Away with the atheists, find Polycarp." Polycarp entered the stadium. The proconsul tried to persuade him to recant, saying, "Have respect for your age," and other such things, as they are accustomed to say. "Swear by the genius of Caesar. Repent and say, 'Away with the atheists.'" So Polycarp solemnly looked at the whole crowd of lawless heathens who were in the stadium, motioned toward them with his hand, and then, groaning as he looked up to heaven, they said, "Away with the atheists." But when the magistrate persisted and said, "Swear the oath and I will release you, revile Christ," Polycarp replied, "For 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? I am a Christian." Polycarp decided to take the advice and wisdom of this message from Revelation literally and seriously. He decided which crown was worth wearing. And he will, I know, have experienced the great victory of finding Jesus even in his death. Verse 11 makes clear. If you can hear, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Those who emerge victorious won't be hurt by the second death. I'm going to jump to a couple of final points about this idea of the crown of life. The crown of life, I think, is costly, not comfortable. It's costly, not comfortable. We don't like that naturally. But that's the invitation. If you want abundance, it doesn't cost like you have to earn your salvation or something like that. But it costs a life following a crucified Messiah into the hard things. And it's not always comfortable. The crown of life invites us to be consumed by love, not entitlement. Consumed by love, not entitlement. Consumed by what matters, not the things that you think matter. And so our final question as we close in prayer: which crown will you wear? Which crown will you wear? Will you, those who are able, will you please stand with me as we close and pray and reflect on this question? Jesus, we pray, as we continue in worship, as we continue to seek you, that the crown that we would seek in the small things, in our relationships, in the big things, in our decision making. God, we ask that you would help us to courageously each day pursue the crown of life, pursue the way of Jesus, pursue, even in suffering, your heart for this world. We give you honor, glory, and praise. Receive our time of worship. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen.